And good evening, and welcome back to Continual. I am Jim Nettles. I'll be your moderator for the evening. And tonight we're going to be talking about writing with the fairy mythology. We're going to be talking about the fair folk and how they come and influence our work. We're going to be talking a little bit about how we see them historically and how we can work them into what we're doing and what we're writing. So tonight I'm going to ask my guests to introduce themselves. Holly, I'm going to go with you first.
Okay, I'm Holley Trent, and I am a romance author of dozens of books spanning a few different categories. I write paranormal, fantasy, contemporary, and science fiction romance, so I kind of straddle a whole bunch of different spheres. Um, Specifically to fairies, I have a series that's a spin-off of another one that's called Hearth Motel, and it deals with this intersection of this band of roving she um, warriors who basically take up residence on a Outer Banks hotel and basically just sort of turn the owner's life upside down and start bleeding into the framework there. And it's funny, it's a little campy and over the top, and that's me in a nutshell. So
Stephanie.
Hi, everybody. My name is Stephanie Burke. I go by the nickname Flash. My pronouns are she and her. I've been writing professionally for over 20 years, so that makes me a USA Today bestselling author of over 90 books. Lots of them. Our main subject is romance, paranormal, sci-fi, horror, you name it, I'm going to toss it in there if I'm going to have some interest in writing it. And my latest novel series that's dealing with the Fae is by Changeling Press, and it's the Mayfly Mysteries. In this, we are dealing with the intersection of fantasy and reality, and it asks the question, what happened if the Fae world actually existed during modern times, and how would these people be treated? I mean, it's also a little bit of a murder mystery, but it is fun, and it has humor in it. And that's the latest thing that I'm doing, but I've been writing fairies for a number of years, and I really love the subject.
Mr. Asher, sir.
I am Eric Asher. I'm the author of Vesik, Steamborn, Mason Dixon, and a few other things. Yeah, that's about it.
Cutchin.
I am not nearly as creative as anybody else here because I do not write fiction. I write what I prefer to tell people on the airplane when I'm sitting beside them, speculative nonfiction, because that's a more polite way of saying that I write about UFOs and Bigfoot and fairies. Fairies are fairies are a personal point of affection for me, and I strongly believe that a lot of what we would normally call paranormal phenomena can be talked about and at least couched in a lot of the fairy lore that we see. I think it's really compelling. A compelling explanation, if not perhaps objective, to a lot of the paranormal phenomena that we see worldwide. And it's been the major focus of all my books. I'm currently in the process of releasing my second book of Bigfoot lore, talking about specifically like Bigfoot and high strangeness, which there's an entire chapter on Bigfoot and fairies. But my book following that will be released by August Night Press, and it's specifically about fairies in film. On film, and I'm very happy to announce, I think here for the first time, that it will include a previously unreleased interview with Brian Froud, who is a famous fairy illustrator. So yeah, I'm kind of the fairy guy, which when I went to Ireland 3 years ago, there were some people in pubs that made fun of this big this big fat dude being into fairies, but that's me. I love me some fairies. So.
And EJ.
I'm EJ Russell, pronouns she, her. I am the author of over 20 LGBTQ romances, going from paranormal romantic comedy through supernatural romantic suspense, contemporary rom-com, and historical. I have two series that touch on the world of fairy. One of them is based on Celtic mythology, primarily Welsh and Irish. And the other one is based on Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, which was a very entertaining thing to research without having to actually read the poem. But that's me.
So let's start with a fun question because I can go back and tell you that my start in the couple of my series that actually have are heavy into Fae mythology and lore and things like that go back to my interest in culture and what we see and how they represent it. So I'd be really curious to see how you guys got your real interest in fairy lore. Hopefully it was not because you saw Tinkerbell on Disney, but other than you, Eric, it's okay. Um, so EJ, I'll start by picking on you first.
Okay. Well, my interest in Celtic mythology in general, the Fae are part of that, goes back to the mid 70s when I worked at a bookstore in Southern California and discovered Evangeline Walton's retelling of the Mabinogion. And I read those and was fascinated by them because they were so not Greek. Everything about Celtic mythology is just skewed from what the sort of the classical mythology that gets taught in grade schools and whatnot is like. And it was fascinating to me. And there were several pieces of the stories in those tales that really stuck with me. And years later, when I started writing, that's what I went back to because that was my first introduction to it. So using that, the concept of Anun and Erewhon and all of the she mounds and other kinds of things, and trying to build it into a concept of fairy that I could use in sort of an urban fantasy setting. Because what I ended up doing is fairy is a construct in my novels. It's something that the elder gods created specifically because they decided that the Fae were subservient to the Druids, and so it became a sort of symbiotic relationship that over time got lost in that particular. Because the Druids and the Fae sort of became inimical to one another. So they didn't speak, they didn't remember where all of this started. And that's sort of where my series begins, as they're trying to discover where they came from, what's going on. The Seelie and the Unseelie courts have been diminishing over time. The Breton Faes are gone, the Cornish are gone, the Manx are gone. So in order for them to continue, they have to merge both Seelie and Unseelie courts, which are inimical to one another. So how did they do that?
So Josh, how did you wind up getting and becoming apparently the ferryman now?
It's going to sound a little bit cliche and to not be too punny, sort of airy fairy, but I don't think I found them as much as they found me. Unlike a lot of people in the paranormal, I don't have this giant sort of Rolodex of paranormal experiences. But I really think that I've sort of been skirting the edges of a lot of this interest for a long time. Big fan of all this sort of Freudian, Henson-y sort of works like Labyrinth and Dark Crystal, and for some reason, back in 2012, I got my first day gig, my first day job at the University of Georgia, and I was commuting an hour each way, and I started listening to the Mysterious Universe podcast, and started really finding again these interests that I've had for a long time. And one of those things that for whatever reason really got stuck in the back of my head was, no matter what happens, you can't prevent a lot of things, but if you ever get taken by, a fairy, just don't eat anything. And and that was just something that just got stuck in the back of my head. And Jim, I'm sure that was sort of the genesis for my first book, A Trojan Feast. And once you start looking at it, once you start looking at the paranormal through this sort of fairy lens, and I really credit Jacques Vallée's 1969 work, Passport to Magonia, looking at the UFO problem through the fairy lens. It just made a lot of the paranormal, which I'd always have a passing interest in my youth. It made it sort of, I don't know if it made sense, but it sort of gave it some structure. And I think that's really where I started to really find that this resonated with me. As I finally admitted to on a podcast that will be coming out a couple weeks from now, I find space really boring, but UFOs really interesting, which puts me at an interesting intersection of someone who's writing about these subjects. But I think the fact that, and so I'd always been sort of skeptical of the idea that, you know, UFOs represent extraterrestrials, and this contact experience, more specifically the extraterrestrial contact experience, what people would call, you know, alien abductions. I've always been really skeptical that that represents actual extraterrestrial contact. But once you put that within the framework of a lot of these fairy folklore, again, my work tends to focus on Western Europe, although it is sort of a holistic global phenomenon, and that's what has also drawn my attention. If you really focus it within this sort of Western European folklore, which is mirrored elsewhere, it really made everything start to make a little bit more sense for me personally. And I'm like, let's see how far we can take this. And as it turns out, for me at least, I think if you look at the extraterrestrial problem through the little people lens, and if you incorporate the little people folklore of every continent, it all starts to make a lot. It at least has precedent. I won't say it makes more sense, but at least has a precedent in terms of the way that we interact with what we should, in my opinion, still call this other world. So that's my entry. That's my gateway drug, I guess.
And I will say I do use a Trojan feast as a reference in a lot of my writing as well, because
Thank you.
food is very much a part of a lot of the stuff that I write. So just as a good reference. Eric.
So mine's way less interesting. I don't know if you all went through the same phase, but like when I was younger, I wanted to sound really smart. So I'd read a lot of classics and stuff. And that led me into Yeats, a lot of Yeats's work, which led me to Lady Gregory. And Lady Gregory's stuff just really stuck with me because she would go around and collect a lot of local folk tales and document them and then release them in a book format. And a lot of those stories just really stuck with me. So some of her stories in, I think it was the northeast or northwest of Ireland. I forget the name of the book now, but it's on the shelf behind me. She had a story about Nixies in it, which influenced my character Nixie in the Vesik series, and a lot of influence came from that. And that eventually led into a lot of modern fairy literature, and of course, just general high fantasy in general. When I really got into that, probably early 20s, mid 20s, I really started to enjoy not only characters that were like specifically fairies, but also people like Tad Williams in his Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn trilogy, where he has characters that have a lot in common with the Fae, even though they aren't specifically Fae. And I really like how people kind of twist the legends and stuff with that.
Stephanie?
3 things. Number one, when I was we all learned to read early. I was reading at 4 years old. And it's a big gap between me and my older sister. So they had a lot of their college texts and things that were just sitting around, some of their books from high school. And I would just page through that out of curiosity because I wanted to be smart. I couldn't be the pretty one. I couldn't be the one who had the beautiful singing voice, but I was the kid who was going to be the smart one. I knew where my strengths were. So I remember taking this book of poetry to kindergarten and having my teacher read some of it because it was show and tell and I wanted to show this poem. It was about Queen Mab. And it was Queen Mab dancing through people's dreams, really tiny fairy and an acorn. And that stuck with me for a while. It was cute, but then it got pushed aside until I started hanging out with some of the guys and D&D came in. And I was a huge D&D fan. I was the only girl in the group. I was like the major DM that they refused to let me be the DM after because I would put them just through all kinds of torture. But it was a lot of fairy-based things, and they wanted to, you wanted to illustrate what your characters were. Way back in the day when you make somebody's basement, ate Funyuns and drink Mountain Dew. So we wanted to actually illustrate what some of our characters look like. And that dove me into the fairy things again. And as I got older and the group broke up, I kind of let it slide. The third thing, believe it or not, was Disney's Gargoyles. I'm not a big fan of Disney, But oh my goodness, did I love Goliath and the Gargoyles.
Mm.
When they just brought
Chief
in
David, yep.
and I was like,
Yep.
wait a minute, I know this. I've been skirting this for a long time. Maybe it's time I did kind of a deep delve into this. I think I was about maybe 11 or 12, maybe 13 at the time. Just let me dig into this and find out. When I started digging, I kept finding more interesting connections into what people believe now with religion, with society as a whole, with rules, especially how you're supposed to behave, how otherworldly and inhuman that the Fae characters believe. They had their own system of belief that was completely different than what humanity was. And I found myself thinking, you know what, they're kind of right. You know, that lack of rudeness thing, you know, you don't give somebody your name. That's giving a personal power over yourself. All these little things added up to me to be really, really fascinating. And then MTV came out with a show called Manx. I don't know if anybody remember that. It was this guy who was it was supposedly kind of crazy, and he was this big homeless guy, and in his mind he was Manx of the Modido. So everything he would see would be, he was living in like a slum, and everything in his world, in his mind, when he would have these episodes, was like the Fae world. He was running through Scotland, he had a sword, and he was doing all these things, but in reality he was just this bum who might have killed somebody. And this was early days of MTV. So it was like all these things went together to create this fascination for me. And it was like, there's not just one world. There's a multiverse within this multiverse within this multiverse. When you started looking at the connections between the Nordic culture and how that bled into the Celtic fantasies and the Celtic fairies that we have, oh, I was hooked. And then, like I said, it goes right back to that different inhuman belief. Things that were acceptable to them that wasn't quite acceptable to us. And then there was the punishment, because the punishment should fit the crime, even though sometimes it was a little bit excessive. But I mean, you get what you earn. So it came back to karma. So by the time I hit college, I was so fascinated with this world that I was trying to grab every little bit I could find in what Shakespeare was doing, what Keats was doing, what other famous poets were doing. And then I tried to find where the high fantasy authors were. I came into Lord of the Rings a little bit late, but the Lord of the Rings fairies, their elves, seem so much like Finn McCool and their and the fairies and the Finians, because you know they got Disneyfied. Because at one point, fairies were these huge, gigantic warriors that had swords and beat giants, and they did all these wonderful things. And then suddenly they got cute, and they got really, really tiny. And it's like, wait a minute, we were terrified of this, and now we've taken and given, you know, the fairy tale treatment. Fairy tales were often cautionary tales. They weren't happy and sweet and had these wonderful endings. When I started finding the real fairy tales, that just added to it. And ever since then, I've been hooked. I've been finding ways to incorporate the Fae world, Fae beliefs, and there's so many different categories of Fae. They're so diverse. So I was trying to grab as much diversity as I can to get us away from that, you know, little cute clap for Tinkerbell blue fairy thing that we had going on for years.
Holly. So
honestly, for me, yeah, it's pretty mundane. So it was a matter of necessity. The way I approach writing books is that I have a very scant idea of what a book is going to do. I know what the characters need to do, though. So I build the characters out first, and then I worry about how I'm going to get there in the plot. And I basically needed characters to behave a certain way and for them to make sense in the context of the world building and the magic system that's there. And that's how I ended up studying Fae and how they connect to some of the pantheons, and well, not just in Western Europe, but sweeping across Eurasia and into Africa and parts of, you know, the indigenous Americas as well. But also, like 15 years ago, and I had totally blocked this out when I started researching for these series, I actually read Laurel K. Hamilton's Mary Gentry series, and I had totally like wiped out that I had experienced that. So it was interesting to see how her reading of that folklore tied in with what I learned about that history, like, you know, a decade or so later. But that's basically how I got there. It was just a matter of necessity.
Well, let's talk a little bit then about research, because now that we've sort of dived in where everybody's coming from, so we know that you kind of get into that thing. So if we compare Greek mythology, like EJ was talking about, Greek mythology to Celtic mythology, having studied a lot of Celtic mythology is messy. Now, Greek mythology, at least there's a certain degree of order to it. There may be a lot of Zeus's kids running around, but there's at least a certain defined order to it. A lot of Celtic mythology is much more messy. It feels lived in. It feels almost more human, more real. So, is that one of the reasons that you really rely on that in terms of what you're writing and what you're working on, is because it feels more lived in, it feels more real, it feels more human, especially when we look at the fact that we have those cultural memories and stories pretty much across the world. So is that one of the things you get into, is to why you're working with it and why it's so impactful for you? I'll throw that out there to see who wants it first.
Yeah, I mean, for me, sure. I love a good mess. And was it hard picking apart, all these different bits of stories and where they intersected? Yeah, it was. But for what my purposes were in the series that I write, I could use that to sort of turn it on its ear and make it something new. So I actually appreciated that about Celtic mythology.
Also, it's more interesting. I mean, because it is so peculiar. I mean, some of the creatures in Celtic mythology are just completely bonkers. I mean, the Nukulevi, it looks like a horse with a man's torso on top of it, but all of it has no skin. There's some that are, more toad-like. I mean, there's this whole range of creatures that are not anthropomorphized at all, the way all of the Greek and Roman stories are sort of the idealized human form, like the statues at the time. So
yeah,
there's so many more interesting corners to explore.
I would definitely agree with that, EJ. I think that probably perhaps second to, the Japanese yokai tradition, which is absolutely batshit insane in terms of umbrellas with one eye jumping around, which the yokai could kind of be viewed in sort of if you squint and turn your head, it sort of looks like a fairy cosmology. I would agree that, that there is that quality. There's also an interesting thing that I've at least found in sort of the Celtic mythology is that unlike those sort of Mediterranean mythologies, they tend to be a little bit more, again, they tend to be messier, but also more antagonistic to human beings. They're not like, you don't necessarily have that exact Promethean. I mean, most cultures have a trickster character who sort of gains knowledge from the gods and brings it back to humanity, but you don't sort of have that sort of
in your face disdain.
Yeah. There seems to be sort of a more. You don't have the sort of altruism amongst any of those Celtic demigods. Like, they're doing their own thing, and they sort of tolerate the fact that you're there. They're like, that's sort of
until you serve a useful purpose.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Which, I mean, if we're going to go into the quote unquote objective, which I don't want anybody to think here. Well, I do think there's an objective reality to this stuff, but it goes into that sort of. If there is an objective reality to this, that's definitely a motif that recurs time and again. You find, I think of specifically Crofton Croker, who wrote the legendary, no, that was Kennedy. Crofton Croker was a collector of folktales in the British Isles, and he wrote that amongst the humans, the elves divided them as property, and you'll find that same sentiment echoed in Charles Fort's early works. Charles Fort being an early investigator of paranormal phenomena, who says, I think we as human beings are property. And you'll sort of see that echoed again in the work of Whitley Strieber, famous contactee who wrote Communion in 1986, who said, you have no right to be doing this to me. And the visitors, the aliens, the extraterrestrials or whatever said, oh, we have every right. So you sort of find this sort of creepy, I hesitate to say sort of property relationship, but almost like a sort of disdain for our role in the world, in the fact that we're sort of a secondary thought that can be used and exploited as need be, as a species, as a human species, and that finds its way into a lot of this folklore, I find.
Because you brought up Asian mythology, I have to go through some of their philosophies. When you look at especially Japanese horror, you'll find that unlike American or European horror, it's not that you're a good person that needs to be punished. It is just that you noticed them and they noticed you noticing them. Therefore, it's none of your business. Why are you in here? You're going to get it. You can be the best person in the world, but in Asian mythology, if you notice that bad thing over there, it's going to follow you home.
Yeah,
I found that there's an element of that when you deal with Celtic mythology, because otherwise, generally, they don't mess with humans. Humans always tend to be the ones that stumble onto them. And then it's, oh, okay, you did this. Let's play a game with you. Or let's see how you're going to react or how you're going to behave if we do this. Suddenly humans become, like you said, kind of a curiosity.
Well,
let's see what this thing is going to happen. Let's see what this thing is going to do. And I kind of find that really, really fascinating when you get away from European mythology, that the whole attitudes and the belief systems completely change, they're completely altered. And that's something that's considered normal to them.
It's almost amoral, not in the sense of being without morality. It's amoral in the sense of being completely removed and displaced from morality, if that makes any sense. It's like there's just everything is what it is, you know. And if it serves,
Yet they have their own rules. I mean,
right.
Any interaction has some kind of defined rule, like the Welsh lake maidens. You know, they'll come in and they'll mate with a human man, but there's a rule. I mean, you can't have 3 causeless blows, or they're going to go away back to the lake and take all of their wealth with them. And same way with, don't go to brunch with the Fae. Don't eat when you're there.
Ignorance of the rules is no excuse for breaking the rules. I love that. But, that's one of the reasons why I find it so fascinating. And I got Greek burnout. By the time I was 8 years old, I knew all about Greek mythology. They threw in Norse mythology. I love Loki. He had a reason for doing it. I don't blame him. Loki was rotted. He was given the shaft. But when you look at that compared to Celtic mythology, it was something that was completely new, and it was completely unique at that time, because it's not something that they really teach. I think it has to do with the intersection between mythology and the religion. And then the way they blended their mythology in, even some of their rulers, their kings, their tribal lords and stuff were considered Fae or partially Fae. They wrapped their mythology right into their reality. It was grounded in there, which created something that was unique, different, which is why I know a lot of the churches, when they came in to try to bring Christianity in, they had a hard time with that. Because how are you going to sit there and tell these people that you are not a god, you are not related to this particular Fae creature or this person, when in their family history, it's gone back 20, 30 generations, this is what they believe in.
Well, it was animistic in the sense of being grounded in the present that I think that Greek and Norse mythology is not. Greek and Norse mythology seems like it was always sort of like backwards looking, with the exception of things like Ragnarok, which always is, this sort of undefined point in the future that you sort of progress to. But like, there was always a sense that, for me at least, that a lot of that sort of Celtic mythology was always sort of being you were inside of it. It was happening and sort of drawing you forward in the now, if that makes any sense.
The Greek mythology and these others were always on Mount Olympus, looking down on humans. Whereas you go with the Celtic mythology, a lot of the Asian mythology, they were right there interacting with people.
Yeah. It's in that tree over there. It's in the pond over there. It's that sort of thing.
It's
right in your house.
Yeah, exactly.
Look at that ring of mushrooms. Don't step in that. It was physical, as opposed to these other things when they were on high looking down on people, and maybe you get a lightning bolt to the butt if you did something wrong. So it's a little bit, that's a major difference in what we are generally taught as children.
I don't know, a lightning bolt to the butt sounds kind of exciting to me right now, but
you have young twins. Anything sounds exciting to you right now.
That's true.
So if we look at this, does the spirituality that kind of inherently comes along with Fae mythology then, is that one of those things that you're really working into your work? Is that one of those things that you really find influential? Is that one of those things that even if you're not necessarily coming and hitting somebody over the head with it, there's an underlying faith and belief that goes along with incorporating anything with the Fae, because if nothing else, the Fae exist to screw with you because they've got nothing better to do. In so many different mythologies and so many different views, it's like you say, you saw us, you stepped through the wrong door, you stepped through the wrong portal, you ate the wrong thing off the snack tray. Now you're going to go take a trip to fairyland. Is that something that underlying belief system is something that really is core to the work you're doing?
I think that can partially tie into the previous question too, about how it can be kind of messy. Greek mythology is always very structured. Like there's an official version, and this is what really happened, and this is how everyone retells the story. And you get into the Celtic mythologies, and this might be the case in some stories, but they vary wildly depending on who's documenting it, what their source is, who they happen to talk to on what road, on what year, and it's so the underlying meanings in some of those stories can be a little bit different between books that you read to study them. So,
well, the fact that they're, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
And the fact that they weren't actually documented in their raw form. I mean, by the time anyone wrote anything down about them, they'd already been tainted by the Romans and by Christianity coming in. It's like nobody wrote down anything when the Druids were still in power. We don't know anything about them. So who knows what they were really like? It becomes something that you can, one of the reasons I like it is you can imagine almost any outcome or any reason for them to start acting the way they do, because nobody knows.
And it's how religion interacted with them. There are stories that said one of the last of the Fenians actually was a chess player and spent a lot of time with Patrick, St. Patrick. And it's like, wait a minute, these two things should not be going together at this point. But if you can't, it goes with history, if you can't get rid of that religious belief, you incorporate it into your own belief system. That way you bring the people in. But that also means a lot of things were left askew, a lot of things were destroyed, and a lot of things were just left guessing. And I believe it's because we have so much to guess and so much guesswork to play with. It makes it a little bit easier to put our own twist on things when we're writing our fiction, unlike you would do with a lot of Greek and Roman mythology and their deities, because, Zeus was a god of thunder in the sky and all this, and, Ares was the god of war, and he had different attributes that are attributed to him. But that's all written down, like you said before, in harmony with what everybody else was saying. That's structured. You might find several different variations. It's going to be tainted a little bit, but the core of it remains the same. Whereas you can't really put your finger on the core of a lot of Celtic mythology, just because so much was destroyed, it was lost. The meanings of them were altered to bring in this new religion to bring people together. I mean, you look at some of the churches where some of the Celtic gods were destroyed because they had goat heads or horns that made them look like the devil. So they, instead of, destroying the whole church that these were based on, let's chisel off this piece here and chisel off this piece here and start a new mythology behind it. So it is very, very extremely messy, and it's almost to the point where you cannot put your finger on one thing definitively. You just have to research around it and go right through the middle of all the research that you find.
And that's what makes it fun.
Oh, yeah.
So let's actually then talk about research. So let's say that I'm sitting there and I'm a writer thinking about writing in urban fantasy and horror or even nonfiction, whatever the case may be. So if you're starting to dive into your research and you're trying to work with these mythological characters that, like we say, are not so well documented, we've got frameworks, we've got ideas, but all of them are told through someone else's viewpoint. They're told through someone else's framework even. So as you're doing that research, I mean, one of the most famous characters that I think most people know of if they know of the Fae, other than like Queen Mab, is going to be Puck, which comes from Shakespearean Midsummer Night's Dream. I mean, I think that Puck has so entered a lot of the mainstream idea and thought, but again, he's somebody that was made up as a part of Shakespearean tradition. So when you guys are diving into and starting your research and starting to look at that and starting to look and see, I need this sort of a character, I need this sort of a motif to work into a story or into an idea or to help prove a concept, how are you going about the research?
The internet is your friend. Stay away from Wikipedia. But the internet is your friend.
And your enemy. And your enemy.
Oh, your enemy, definitely, because they do their research. They are serious about their education. What they call the edutainment, they are serious about their edutainment. So, you can go and research some of the things that they put out. But it's just, for me, a matter of getting to different venues. I will go through some college libraries. I will dig through some different mythology websites. There was Encyclopedia Mythologica that was around for years that I just saved pages and pages of information on, because they give you sources at the end. So you just follow the sources that you source from somebody else, and you just compile as much of it as you can. Well, that's just how I do. Like just fairly recently, for a series I'm writing for Changeling also, called The Wild Hunt, I needed a Celtic god, but it had to be a raven. So are there any Celtic raven gods? I start digging and I come across Bran. Bran's not exactly a Celtic god, but he is somebody who was considered to have Fae blood, who was beheaded at it was an interesting family gathering, let's say. And
Yes, it was, wasn't it?
He was beheaded and his head was placed on a pike to look over his land and partially of England, of London, so that he would always be there to protect it, which is where the ravens from from Buckingham Palace, they say if the ravens ever leave, everything's going to fall. That's one of the reasons. It's because of him. When I discovered this, I was like, 2 months ago old. And it was like, wow, I didn't know that this would lead me into this. So then you just have to find your avenues. You have to research everything that you can find. And I like to actually go to fable tellers. You find a bunch of them on YouTube. They are actually doing visual recordings of their mythologies and the reactions to them. And it varies from different region to different region. If it's Welsh, if it's going to be, say it's going to be something that's straight out from Scotland or Ireland, they vary. But those people are just giving you a visual documentation of the mythology that they grew up with. So I find that that's kind of helpful too. So for me, it's just, I don't have one particular way of doing it. I just source as many resources that I can find. And, getting rid of the stuff that's kind of crazy, or the stuff that, games like video game developers have taken and twisted around to meet their agenda. You push that aside and try to get to the true mythology told by the people that actually live there. And I found that that's very, very helpful for me.
I started out, because I'm old, I started out actually ordering books. It was when I was working in that bookstore, I could special order books. So I ordered British Goblins by Wirt Sykes. I ordered lots of books on Welsh mythology that had
That's a
really
great book, by the way.
Because,
yeah, great book.
So I started there. Catherine Briggs has an encyclopedia of fairy that I have a hard copy of. So I started out there and branched out into the internet once it was available to me. But I have a whole shelf full of books that are more or less useful. I also have all of the English and Scottish popular ballads.
Yeah, I think that. So I'm notoriously antagonistic towards people like just finding these sort of posts on online forums and throwing them into their supernatural books. But at the same time, when I first met my publisher, Patrick Weege of Anomalous Books, who was somebody that I had anomalous books on my bookshelf when I was in middle school. Like, it was a big moment for me that I got to be with Patrick. And Patrick was like, "You must have a huge library." I'm like, "No, I don't. I'm just really good at using the resources that are available to me." But there's
don't look at my library. Just don't look at my library.
Well, I mean, like I have a ton of stuff that my wife is like, "Sell some of these." I'm like, "No, I use this for that book, and I might use it again someday." So I'm definitely supporting the book market in general. But there are so many resources on the internet, and I feel, as someone who is by and large sort of in line with Stephanie's philosophy of not necessarily just going to the internet for everything that you need, There's so much good stuff out there. And by that I mean like looking at like archive.org, which is not just a website to bring back old dead internet pages, but also they have PDFs that you can check out. But there are so many ways to sort of educate yourself without saying like, oh, I read this on Reddit, or oh, I read this on an online forum. And look, honestly, there's some good stuff in those places. But if you're going to present that, for me, this is, I guess, more of an issue than anybody else here, because y'all are writing fiction and like, I don't want to say who cares if it's real or not, but like, because you want to ground it in some basis of reality. But for me, like, I have to sort of present this as like, oh, this is what people are saying. If you find 2 or 3 or 4 people saying sort of the similar thing about a subject, then you can kind of say, well, this is sort of a consensus gentium, and you can sort of, put that forward in your work. But the internet is, it's an awful tool for people who don't use it well. And I'm talking about like, college kids who cite Wikipedia as a source, but it's an amazing tool if you have the wherewithal to sort of doggedly track stuff down to the bottom of the rabbit hole. If you look at that citation on Wikipedia and then you find where that citation was, and does it take you to a crazy right-wing website, or does it take you to a publication that has an objective reality work? Does it, how far, like, what's at the bottom of that rabbit hole? And if the bottom of that rabbit hole yields gold, then go with it and run with it. And I think that the internet is both properly maligned for being, a garbage heap of information, but also sort of it's dismissed way too often as being that, when actually there's some really good stuff to be mined there. You just have to know what fool's gold looks like versus actual gold.
And other authors, because if I know an author that has written a book and it was awesome.
Yeah,
and
the reputability. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I will definitely tag somebody. Where'd you get this research? Can I have it? Do you still have it? Please, please, please. I have no problems begging.
Oh, how I have done that.
Also, I think the library is highly underappreciated with things like this. Like, not only can you go in and get whatever they happen to have on the shelf, but every library that I'm familiar with, and my uncle's a librarian, they have a special ordering system that can find the most obscure random things. I mean, there was a book on the Civil War I wanted to read. Only 400 copies were printed back in like 1930 something. They found one, no problem. I mean, just really random stuff they can get for you.
Yeah.
And I'd always advocate that over piracy. Like that. Yeah. As an author, anything that's like piracy or supports piracy, I've got to say that's just not cool.
No, thank you for that, Eric, because that's something that I'm a bit remiss in terms of addressing is the level of ability that interlibrary loan like allows you to have access to, especially if you live like near your alma mater and you have like alumni status and you can actually go to the library and request that sort of thing. It's a great, amazing resource. Yeah, 100%.
Well, I think we can all, as authors, spread a lot of love for the librarians. Holley?
I think it kind of goes back to what Stephanie was saying about researching around topics. And because I write romance and there are certain conventions and I can't get too deep into background information, I mostly research to see if things are plausible or, if it passed the sniff test, I guess, and figure out a way if I can connect it to some other mythology so that it creates more possibility for there being truth in it. So if I can make someone believe that this probably happened, I just give just enough information to season the story, but I'm not going to give you 3 pages of the raw mythology. It's something that I just can't do in what I write.
The advantage to writing fiction too is that we don't have to be all that specific or I can't think of the word, but we can make up what we want.
Within reason, yeah.
Yeah, I hate all of you. I'm sort of an end note fetishist, as I'm sure Jim will sort of attest to. And it's, yeah, I envy all of you. But at the same time, I don't envy all of you because, you know, I try to think about, like, I mean, setting aside this sort of Jungian idea that ideas have people versus people having ideas, and that this sort of stuff, which I think you would probably all attest to, comes to you just as much as you fabricate it. Man, I sit awake at night, I'm like, I'm going to write a novel, and then I start thinking about, like, these turns of phrase that I've read in this latest book that I'm reading. I'm like, no, I couldn't do that. I couldn't do that. So hats off to each of you. Yeah, 100%.
So, I'm sorry, go ahead, Steph.
Artistic license is a thing.
Ex-
So you have, actually, the way I do, I'll have 20 spiral notebooks filled with information that will never make it into the story.
Use one line of it, yeah.
Yeah. But so long as I understand and it helps to develop my characters' motivations and their reasonings behind doing stuff, it's okay. I don't mind putting it in.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, Trivial Pursuit. So
Yeah.
Yeah, if you ever want to play, you know, if you're ever looking to play bar trivia and make sure you win, you sit down with all the authors. As long as it's not sports trivia, in which case you're just screwed.
Also true.
So let's dive a little bit into, you know, one of the things that we have to do is, as with all mythology, as with all faiths, beliefs, things like this, there's a cultural tradition that goes with it. There's certain realities we have to look at, things we have to deal with, and things that we have to have certain sensitivities about. And even if you're talking about something and we start talking about the fairies, there's still, as you say, objective realities behind many of these stories, because generally when we look at mythology, it represents a cultural warning. It represents a cultural idea. It represents, you know, something that people saw that they didn't fully understand or didn't have another bit of language for. And this is kind of a universal, you know, global idea. So when you are starting to grab some of these mythological creatures, you know, we talk a lot now about sensitivity in what we write and how we present people and what we're doing. So as we're starting to get a better understanding of the historical reality behind some of these ideas and beliefs, how is that something you're working in, and how is that something you're trying to treat and manage from a respectful basis? Or sometimes, like I've been known to, poke absolute fun at it, and poke the bear.
That kind of goes back to what I was saying about turning things on its ear and changing it enough that it's not fully resemblable to what it started as. Because I am very mindful that this was someone's belief system, and I do that with every sort of creature group that I incorporate into my writing, whether it's like, you know, Mexican gods or, you know, Greek gods, or like using the Fae. So I changed it enough to make it, you know, current and, you know, relatable, but I'm also, you know, mindful that it has to be respectful, because there are probably people who still, you know, believe in these, you know, these thought systems. And so, you know, you try not to disparage it. You can, you know, criticize it, but you have to find ways of criticizing without disparaging the entire structure that is built on it, basically.
And when it comes to me, there are some things that I find horrible and disturbing, and I find myself wanting to bring a light to that. Not so much as to point and say what you believed back then was completely and total evil, even if I feel it was, because it was a different mindset at that point. People didn't have the information that they have. They didn't have access to genetic codes, or they didn't have access to science that would explain some of these things that people found so puzzling. So if I do run across something like that, we were talking before about the changelings. And we all now know that the almond-eyed shaped changeling were children who were probably autistic or had Down syndrome. And the abuses that they suffered were horrific. If in my story I bump across that in a modern time, because I rarely do historicals, if I bump across that in a modern time, I do my best not to judge, but to put an objective experience onto what I'm showing. It's just me showing what had happened. These are the reasons why this happened. Not saying it was good, not saying it was bad, just saying that it was. This happened. And I try to be as respectful as I can and leave my personal opinion out of that, unless it's coming from another character, which is great about fiction writing, because I can bring another character in who's absolutely horrified, who says all the things that I want to say, and it won't disparage somebody's family history, or it won't cause a big rift because people saying you don't understand this. I get it. I researched it. I understand that I, as a writer, can't use that as my narrative voice because that opens up a huge cesspit, basically, and I don't like swimming in cesspits, but I can create a character that will express what I feel. Secondary character, tertiary character, it doesn't matter. I can throw somebody in with a voice that will offset what's happening on screen or what I'm intending to show. Because some of the things that we've done for the sake of our children, for the sake of religion, for the sake of our own belief systems, are horrific by modern standards. But by that same token, you look back in the past, it would be okay, like beating your wife. We all know about the rule of thumb. So, or, you know, the nag's bridle that they used to put in women, or, you know, if you go back to Asian culture again, bukkake, everybody has a way of punishing their people at that time that seemed to be relevant and acceptable for that time period. But time changes, things shift, people's belief systems and society changes as well. So when we're dealing with something like that, we have to keep in mind that that may have been acceptable 200 years ago, not so much now, but it's there, it's fact, it happened. So if we're going to do this, we must do it respectfully, and we must do it not in a way to provoke a negative and angry response.
So I'm going to push back a little bit on sort of the cultural relativism angle, not to be completely contrarian, because I agree with you in the aggregate, but I think that that sort of the fairy mythology specifically has been quite detrimental to specific cultures as a scapegoat, and I'm trying to sort of tread lightly here. Somebody gonna say something? I heard somebody jump in. No, okay.
No, I said, yo, you're right.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm saying stop holding back.
So a stat that I'm sure that anybody who's ever listened to me on different podcasts and stuff is tired of hearing this, but I'm just so effing sobered by the stat. There's a book that was written by Elaine Farrell, the Professor Elaine Farrell, called A Most Diabolical Deed, and it looked at infanticide in Irish society just between 1850 and 1900. Now, in terms of like in the Western world, what we would accept as sort of like post-Enlightenment sort of, we should all know that you don't kill babies after 1850. Like that was like a sort of a generally realized societal concept, right? Or societal standard. But in Elaine Farrell's survey and analysis of infanticide just in Ireland, and you got to remember Ireland's about the size of Indiana, she found just between 1850 and 1900 that children less than 3 years old, so if they were 3 years and 1 day old, they didn't make the cut. If they were killed in 1901, they didn't make the cut. So 1850 to 1900, children less than 3 years old, she found that 4,645 children were murdered. And oftentimes the changeling excuse was used in that context. So I think that, and this, you're talking to somebody who believes that like there is an objective reality to fairies and to aspects of the changeling phenomena in terms of being like sort of otherworldly and supernatural. But within that context, you look at that number, and that's just a staggering amount of kids that were killed. So I don't think it's necessary to judge them by a lot of our current cultural mores, but at the same time, that's a lot of children that were killed in a 50-year period on this tiny little isolated island, and you kind of have to sort of layer that against what is ostensibly a religious belief, and at what point do you intervene and say, no, this is not cool, you know?
Well, I mean, by that token, you would also have to look at the number of Irish bastards and children who were given to the church in England from that point before who were murdered. You know, they're digging up graveyards right now, and they're finding hundreds and hundreds of bodies. So, right. Yeah, I agree with you. It was horrific. It was wrong at any stretch of the imagination. But as a writer, I can expose that and let people come to their own conclusions behind it. Because like I said, a lot of it was their religious belief. I'm not going to poke at anybody's religious belief, even if I don't agree with it.
Yeah. Well, and you look at that in the context of a society that, again, not to get too super political, but you look at that in the context of a society that wholly condoned abortion, but was kind of okay with infanticide. And that sort of
it don't quite balance out.
Yeah, it complexifies the matter a great deal. Yeah,
it does.
Well, that was chipper. Sorry.
Well, we brought down the tone just a little bit.
A little bit.
So something that no one's mentioned, if you're writing about a topic that you think people might take issue with, or take issue with the way you're approaching it, a really good thing to do is to hire a sensitivity reader. Because that can really save you from doing something incredibly disrespectful.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I am a sensitivity reader. Yeah, there's space for that when you're dealing with these sensitive topics. You really need to go and find somebody who can be objective. We can read and then look at you and say, okay, this is where you might have gone wrong at. This is where you might need to change this a little bit. And I'm not going to get upset. I mean, good night. You have to be a thick skin to be an author anyway, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. But the more straight you are with us, I mean, I would rather go back and forth the sensitivity reader to make sure my point of view and this story is correct than to have 300 people offended and angry writing me horrible emails and giving me hate mail.
But I will sell you a bulk deal. If you want to burn my books, I'll sell them to you at a 10% discount.
Book burning. No. Wait a minute. Is that net or gross?
EJ?
Yes.
Anything to add to that, or?
Well, because I write romance like Holley, and I write LGBTQ romance, a lot of the world building I do is sort of removed from a lot of that. Well, for one thing, it's more contemporary. It's all more, urban fantasy kind of thing. It takes place in the current world.
That baggage, right?
Yeah, and because I am personally an atheist, it's like any religion is the same to me. It's all mythology. So when I create the worlds for my particular series, a lot of times what I'll do is create the religion the way I want it to be. That being said, that I also have a family tree of the House of Dawn from Welsh mythology, and all of those, the early gods from the Mabinogion, and I'll reference those. But most of the time, I'm not specifically looking at religious elements. I do have druids in my books, so when I was writing those, I looked at modern druidism to see whether or not I was doing anything that might run counter to what they might believe currently.
So let me ask a question along those lines. So if we're in, do you feel that using things like fairy folklore and mythology and things along these lines make a good allegory, and it kind of gives us permission to skirt boundaries we normally wouldn't? I mean, for example, I've got a story that's written where somebody's killing gnomes and turning them into garden statues. It's completely and totally irreverent little novella. It plays with the idea, but if I was doing this to kids, it would be a lot more objectionable. But because I'm doing it to mythological creatures, people find it funny. And I mean, granted, it was written that way. It's written to be kind of a dark comedy and have fun with it. But do you think because we're using infrequently these mythological creatures, ideas, that we kind of get a little bit more permission and a little bit more latitude in the stories we tell, especially if you're writing LGBTQ, if you're writing in some of these other spaces, we can use that in terms of allegory to get the ideas into a larger audience.
Proxies, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely we can. I mean, I'm trying to think of one that's not going to be too controversial at the moment. But if I'm delving into my own work personally with the Mayfly Mysteries series, the way I tore up everything. I even created new mythology with the gremlins and things like that. I tossed it because we know they didn't exist until World War II. I tossed all those things in, and a lot of the statements that I made about discrimination, about racism, about police violence and things like that were okay and more acceptable and was even humorous when the main character is not exactly human. They're not real, so you can understand the concept, but you can't say this was based on this one particular person right then and there. I found that the message that I got across was really, really widely acceptable, and people came to the conclusions about what I was trying to do on their own. So I mean, my character May, she's a changeling, and she has some issues. She's dating a gremlin. She's also dating a dryad. I mean, she has a very interesting love life. And some of the issues, because we dove into some LGBTQ things, I found people accept threesomes much, much more easier when they're fantasy or fae or mythological creatures than you are with human beings. So I know some conservatives who are like, oh, this is great. And it's like, yeah, you don't really know that I based that on some real people. Yes, it's acceptable, but the minute it's Tom, Dick, and Mary, oh, then there's an issue. But if it's Garloff, Betune, and Sloth, oh yeah, then it's fine, it's great. But you just hope and pray that the message that you're doing with these proxies sink into their minds, maybe they're subconscious some way, and then one day they'll sit up and go, oh, I was talking about this, but I enjoyed it here, and I was cheering on their relationship over here. But that kind of makes me a hypocrite if I, look at somebody in reality and do the same thing. So I'm hoping not to slap people upside the head with the message that I'm giving, or the characters, or even the lifestyle that they're living. I'm giving them a window so that maybe in the future they'll see this, remember the story that they love so much, and go, hey, maybe it's not so bad, maybe it's not so odd, or it's not so crazy. So, I mean, proxies are really, really great for that. They give you so much leeway.
And I would argue because I want all the fiction people to talk about their things too. I would argue that the sort of the sort of idea of the Fae as like a microcosm of human society is sort of baked into the whole mythology, in terms of the stratification of their society and these these different courts and the way that they're very contractual and all that sort of it's and the idea that they were called the gentry, which is synonymous with the way that you would call the upper middle class, or the upper class rather, in Western society as well. I think that like the idea of the Fae as a reflection or a property, as you said, of human life, I think that's sort of just part and parcel for the way that we have interpreted them throughout the years.
I am such a wicked person, because when you said that they go by the name the gentry, I thought of that Gilbert Godfrey joke, the aristocrats.
The aristocrats!
In some way, it kind of parallels with some.
There were 3 fairies who were taking their knuckles, and they were they were called the gentry. Yeah.
If y'all don't know the joke, look it up.
Stephanie, we're on the same page. We're on the same page.
That scares me. So, Eric, anything you want to throw on top of that?
No, I think I got mine in.
All right. Holley, EJ?
Well,
use proxyism. Sorry.
I use greater and lesser Fae as sort of proxies for classism in some of my books. And eventually it comes out that the elder gods did not intend for the greater Fae to be the masters. They were just called that because they were larger. So there was no reason for that kind of classism to exist, and sort of creates a revolution within fairy that it's like, all these things you believed, think again.
Holley? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, it's fine. It's not something that I do intentionally in like my fantasy romance and my science fiction romance. Yeah, I am very intentional and purposeful with it, but there's so many other layers of just banana pants goings on, and the fantasy romance I write that I don't do that on purpose. It may happen in there, and people, I mean, you can read it and let me know if I did, but I don't think I do it on purpose.
Banana pants is my new favorite phrase, by the way. Thank you. I love that.
All right. Well, we've been going for a while here. Anything else you guys want to bring up? Anything you think we've missed? For our budding writers or anybody out there wanting to use the Fae or leverage the Fae, tell the story of the Fae.
Have fun with it. I mean, all of us are authors here. We can all sit down and write the same story. If you give us the fake character and the plot of the story, we'll each come out with different stories in the end. It'll be each representative of our own voices and our own experiences. So don't be afraid to take that plunge and to delve into something new. It might be a little bit foreign to you at first, but then when you start writing, you can compare it to reality, to your own experiences, and you come up with some very, very wonderful stories. I mean, there are so many great stories that are wrapped up in the politics of the time, when reality meets fantasy. The Celtic mythologies give you all that stuff. So, I mean, it's a wonderful thing to play with. Feel free to dive in. I mean, you don't even have... I hate to say this, but you can just go by the Disney route if you really need to and still write an interesting story that would be complex and complete with these particular characters. You can really make them human. You can humanize them very, very easily. So, I mean, do not let the foreignness of them prevent you from actually delving in and trying something.
And there are actually very few boundaries, too. I mean, in the Fae world, I mean, especially Celtic mythology, some of the other Asian mythologies too. I mean, because there aren't any hard and fast contemporary accounts of them, you can pretty much take any spark and generate a completely new world based on it.
Yeah. I can actually see a Celtic fairy creature walking through this world today in modern times more so than I can see somebody from, say, maybe the Roman or Greek pantheon. That tells you how easily they are to shift around.
Well, I would say, if you're so inspired to write fiction, which again, I think I've sort of expressed my admiration for fiction writers, I would encourage people to not shy away from... Don't shy away from mythologies that aren't in your lane. Right. So if there's a mythology that is not part of your personal, heritage, it should, if it's a legitimate mythology that has anything to say about the human condition, it should speak to you in some sense. And I'm making big hands underneath the desk here, big hands. But like the truly valuable mythologies are the mythologies that speak to human experience, regardless of where you come from. And so embrace it. And, I think that that there is so much to be learned about. Once you start looking to mythology of any type, and I would argue sort of to look into all different mythologies and lore, but once you start looking into mythology of any type, the world around you sort of becomes re-enchanted in a way that it doesn't when you just learn words from a dictionary. You understand the meanings of words, you understand the implications of the words, you understand why people build temples on mountaintops, because that was mythologically the place where you were highest to intervene with the spirit world. So just I would just say, like, just take, even if you don't want to write a book of any type, fiction or nonfiction, just dive in, and I guarantee you that it will enrich and re-enchant the world that you're in. 100%.
And it's just so interesting to see where these different mythologies overlap and how the people who created them are different or similar, from those two different stories. And, I look at that a lot when I'm researching things, like, can I find the same story somewhere else? And, how did it impact the people who are telling the story? So I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, and really go find the obscure stuff, because some of the most interesting stories are in the most obscure books. So yeah, follow those references back to find out where the big book that you're reading got their stories from.
The dustier a book is, and the more it's falling apart, the more rewarding it will be in my experience. Yeah.
Unless you're in Japanese animation, then you get easy tied to another world where you're stuck trying to find a way back home.
Yeah,
Actually, right now, that sounds kind of enticing. Right?
It sounds great. 2020. Yeah.
2020, yeah.
The year to be spirited away. Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, in that case, I appreciate everybody joining us this evening to talk about the fairy world and crossing the veil. So I'm going to ask everybody to just sort of wrap up. Where can we find you guys? And so this time, EJ, I'm going to start with you.
My website is ejrussell.com. And I'm on Facebook as EJ Russell. No periods in between my initials there. I don't do much on Twitter, so those are the two places to find me.
Josh?
You can find me at joshuacutchin.com. And I don't blog very often, but when I do, it's really good. So I have my latest book came out in May, which is Where the Footprints End, Bigfoot and the Highest Range of Phenomenon, Volume 1. Volume 2 is supposed to come out this December, and my book on fairies and folklore in cinema is supposed to come out sometime next year. We'll see when. So,
Eric?
You can find me at ericarasher.com, and pretty much any social media platform is just /EricRAsher.
Stephanie?
I am author StephanieBurke.online. That's my website. You can find me on Twitter as Stephanie Burke. You can find me on Instagram as Flashy Cat. Basically, you type in Stephanie Burke and I'm going to pop up. I am everywhere. At least I'm trying to be. I'm still learning to work the TikTok. But like the old people say, the TikTok.
The TikTok, yeah.
Get that out, I'll be on the TikTok too.
Holley?
I live on Twitter, and it's my name, Holley Trent, and that's Holley with an E. And it's not rated G at all, so, be forewarned before you go looking for me. And generally, I keep everything up to date on my website, which is just hollytrent.com.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. And of course, I'm Jim Nettles. You can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentials.net, and of course, continualconvention.com. And I'm on Facebook. Continual's on Facebook. And occasionally I continue my love-hate relationship with Twitter. So I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight and hanging out. And we'll see you again next week on the panel room. Night, guys. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye.